My daughter lost a multi-million-dollar deal because she switched languages halfway through a sentence. She thought I was just an old widower in a faded blue flannel shirt. She thought I was too slow to notice, too ordinary to understand. Then she smiled at her business partner, changed to Italian, and said the one thing she never wanted me to hear. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and finished her sentence for her. The room went silent. Even the man holding a $3.2 million contract forgot to breathe. But if you think this story started in that conference room, stay with me here. It started almost a year earlier. Before we jump in, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Drop it in the comments below. And if you enjoy real stories about family betrayal and quiet revenge, take a second to subscribe. Now let me tell you how one sentence changed everything. My name is Tyson Cox. I'm 68 years old, and if you saw me at the Pick and Save on Oklahoma Avenue in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you probably wouldn't look twice. That's not false modesty. It's just the truth. I drive a silver 2008 Toyota Avalon with 187,000 miles on it. The driver's side sun visor hangs lower than it should. The radio only picks up 3 stations clearly. And every winter, the passenger side door makes a noise that sounds suspiciously like a duck being stepped on. I've never fixed it. At my age, you start making peace with certain sounds. The house I live in sits on South Logan Avenue in Bayview, about 15 minutes from downtown Milwaukee, if traffic behaves itself. It's a modest 2-story brick house with white shutters that need repainting, and a maple tree in the front yard that's older than some marriages. I've lived there for 34 years. My wife Claire and I bought it in the spring of 1991 for $118,000. Back then we thought we were overpaying. Turns out we were wrong about that. We were wrong about plenty of things, actually. But not about the house. That house held birthdays, Christmas mornings, arguments, reconciliations, late-night talks at the kitchen table. It held my daughter's first steps and my wife's last breath. I need you to understand something. When people talk about selling a house, they're usually talking about lumber drywall and square footage. When I talked about my house, I was talking about Claire. She'd been gone for 5 years when this story began. Cancer. That's all I'll say about it, because anyone who's been through it already knows the rest. The hospital rooms, the appointments, the hopeful conversations, the less hopeful conversations, the silence afterward. You know that silence. It follows you home. For a while it sits beside you at dinner. Then one day you realize it has moved into the guest room permanently. Most mornings I woke up around 6. I'd make coffee in the same stained coffee maker Claire always hated. Then I'd sit at the kitchen table and stare out the window at the backyard she'd loved so much. Not because I was sad every morning. Sometimes I was, most days I wasn't. Mostly I was just remembering. There's a difference. Around 6:45, I'd head over to George Webb Restaurant. If you're from Wisconsin, you know the place. If you're not, imagine a diner that has survived purely through stubbornness and eggs. That's George Webb. My best friend Hank Dawson was usually already there when I arrived. Hank and I had known each other since Ronald Reagan was president. He'd spent 32 years as a Milwaukee police officer. Retired now. Though if you asked him, he'd tell you he was still conducting investigations. The investigations just happened to involve fishing reports and neighborhood gossip. One Tuesday morning, I walked in and found him attacking a plate of pancakes. "Morning," I said. Without looking up, he pointed his fork at me. "You look terrible." "I appreciate your concern." "You should." "I'm not sure I do." "You got that old man look." "What old man look?" "The one where you stand up too fast and immediately regret it." I sat down. That narrows it down to every morning since 2017. Hank laughed so hard coffee nearly came out of his nose. That was Hank. He had a gift for making ordinary days feel lighter. And after Claire died, there were times I needed that more than I was willing to admit. The funny thing is, neither of us ever talked much about grief. Men our age sometimes don't. We talk about baseball or weather, or why every new pickup truck costs more than our first houses. But underneath all that, we know what we're really talking about. We're talking about surviving. My daughter Madison didn't come around as often as she used to. That wasn't entirely her fault. Life happens. She was 39, successful, busy, always moving, always closing another deal, always chasing another opportunity. She worked as a high-end real estate broker and had built a pretty impressive career. I was proud of her. I still am in ways that are complicated. Madison lived in Brookfield with her husband Brandon. Big house, luxury SUV, perfect landscaping, the kind of place where every pillow seems professionally arranged. Whenever she visited, she arrived looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Designer handbag, perfect makeup, phone constantly buzzing, everything polished, everything controlled, everything expensive. Sometimes I wondered whether she even realized how much she'd changed. One Saturday afternoon, she stopped by, unexpectedly. I was in the garage trying to convince an ancient lawnmower to cooperate. The lawnmower was winning. Madison walked up the driveway wearing a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my first car. "Hi, Dad?" "Hi, sweetheart." She glanced around. The garage, the driveway, the house. Not in a judgmental way, exactly. More like an investor evaluating property. That should have bothered me more than it did. At the time, I ignored it. She came inside. I made coffee. She didn't drink coffee anymore. Apparently, she'd switched to something involving oat milk and ingredients I couldn't pronounce. I poured myself a mug and sat across from her. For a few minutes, we talked normally. Weather, work, the Packers. Then she looked toward the front window, toward the house, toward the life Claire and I had built. And she said something that seemed innocent. "Dad, have you ever thought about simplifying things? Now stay with me here." Sometimes a sentence sounds harmless. Sometimes it arrives dressed as concern. But something about the way she said it made a little alarm bell ring in the back of my head. Not a loud one, just enough to notice. I smiled. What exactly am I simplifying? The house. I took a sip of coffee. The house seems pretty simple already. She laughed politely. Not genuinely, politely. "You know what I mean." I did, but I wanted to hear her say it. Outside, the maple tree moved in the wind. Inside, my daughter stared at the house she'd grown up in. And for the first time in my life, I felt like we were looking at two completely different things. I saw memories. She saw equity. And that was the moment the first crack appeared. Not betrayal. Not yet. Just a crack. Small enough to ignore. Big enough to matter. The trouble with cracks is they never stay the same size. And over the next few weeks, that crack would grow into something neither of us could stop. Because the next time Madison brought up the house, she wasn't alone. She brought Brandon with her. And that's when things started getting interesting. The next time Madison brought up selling my house, she brought backup. His name was Brandon Keller, my son-in-law. Now, to be fair to Brandon, he wasn't one of those villains you see in movies. He didn't twirl imaginary mustaches or spend his free time plotting against elderly widowers. He was actually a fairly decent guy when I first met him. Hard-working, polite, smart. The problem was that somewhere along the way, Brandon had started confusing success with acceleration. To him, every year needed to be bigger than the last. A larger house, a newer vehicle, a more expensive vacation, a more ambitious investment. He wasn't greedy in the obvious way. He was greedy in the modern American way, the kind that disguises itself as ambition. About 3 weeks after Madison's first conversation, they arrived together on a Sunday afternoon. It was March. Milwaukee was doing that thing it does every year where winter pretends to leave and then changes its mind. The sky was gray. The sidewalks were wet. And I was in the backyard trying to repair a section of fence that probably should have been replaced 10 years earlier. I saw Brandon carrying a cardboard tray of coffees as they walked toward me. That was my first clue. People rarely bring gifts when they're asking for something. "Hey, Tyson," Brandon said. "You're looking suspiciously friendly." He laughed. Madison didn't. That was my second clue. We went inside. I put their coffees on the kitchen table. The same kitchen table Claire and I had bought from a furniture store on South 27th Street in 1994. The same table where Madison had done her homework. The same table where she'd cried after her first heartbreak. The same table where Claire and I spent countless evenings discussing bills, dreams, and ordinary life. Funny how furniture becomes part of a family. People who don't understand that are usually the same people who don't understand houses. For the first 15 minutes, everything felt normal. Madison talked about work. Brandon talked about interest rates. I talked about absolutely nothing important. Then Brandon leaned back in his chair. Madison exchanged a glance with him. And there it was, the real reason they had come. "Dad," Madison began. I almost smiled. Whenever an adult child starts a sentence with "Dad" in that particular tone, there's usually a sales pitch hiding nearby. "Yeah, we were talking about your future." That phrase, your future. Pay attention to that phrase. People rarely discuss your future when they're benefiting from the conversation. I took a sip of coffee. My future seems to be happening right now. Neither of them laughed. That was clue number 3. Madison folded her hands. "You've done an amazing job maintaining this house." I nodded. "Thank you. But it's getting harder, right?" "No." A brief pause. "Well, eventually it will. Eventually everything will." Another pause. Brandon jumped in. "We're just concerned." There it was again. Concern. People can hide a surprising amount behind that word. "We think you'd be happier somewhere smaller." Happier? Less maintenance? I enjoy maintenance. You wouldn't have to mow. I like mowing. You wouldn't have to shovel. I own a snowblower. Madison sighed, very slightly. But I noticed, when you've spent decades analyzing language for a living, you become sensitive to tiny changes in tone. Most people listen to words. I listened to everything around the words. And something felt rehearsed, like they had practiced this conversation beforehand. Madison pulled out her phone. A few moments later, she turned the screen toward me. Photos, a condominium development near Lake Michigan. Modern, expensive, beautiful, cold. At least it felt cold to me. "Look at this place," she said. I looked. Floor-to-ceiling windows, granite countertops, underground parking. Everything shiny, everything new, everything identical. It looked like every other luxury condo I'd ever seen. "Nice. You could sell this house and move somewhere like that." I shrugged. "Why would I?" The silence that followed lasted only 2 seconds. But it felt longer, because they hadn't expected resistance. Not yet. Then Brandon smiled. "We've been looking at some investment opportunities." And there it was. Finally, the truth had entered the room. Not the whole truth, but enough. I leaned back. "What kind of opportunities?" Madison's face brightened. For the first time that afternoon, she seemed genuinely excited. A waterfront development project. Where? Door County. Now that got my attention. Door County is beautiful. Tourists love it. People spend ridiculous amounts of money there every summer. Brandon pulled out a folder. Inside were architectural renderings, marketing materials, financial projections, the ways. The project was called Bellevue Shores, luxury vacation homes overlooking Green Bay, private marina, boutique retail spaces, upscale restaurants, all the buzzwords, all the promises, all the glossy photos. I spent several minutes flipping through the materials. Madison watched me carefully. Too carefully. Like she wasn't waiting for my opinion. She was waiting for my agreement. That distinction matters. Looks expensive, I said. It is, Brandon admitted. But the upside is huge. How huge? Madison named a number. I nearly dropped the folder. Not because the projected profits were impressive, because the required investment was enormous, far larger than I expected, far larger than what I imagined they could comfortably afford. That little observation tucked itself quietly into the back of my mind. I didn't mention it, not yet. Instead, I kept asking questions. Simple questions. Where was the financing coming from? How much capital had already been raised? What percentage ownership would investors receive? What happened if construction costs increased? What happened if interest rates changed? What happened if sales slowed? The more questions I asked, the more uncomfortable Brandon became. Madison kept answering quickly. Too quickly. Like someone trying to stay ahead of a moving train. Eventually, she leaned forward. Dad? There was that tone again. The sales pitch tone. We think this could be a life-changing opportunity. For whom? The question landed harder than I intended. Madison blinked. Brandon looked down. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Madison smiled. A practiced smile. A real estate smile. A smile designed to move conversations where she wanted them to go. For all of us. I nodded slowly. Maybe she believed that. Maybe part of her genuinely did. That's the thing about greed. It rarely introduces itself as greed. Usually it arrives dressed as opportunity, as family, as helping, as doing what's best for everyone. I think Madison genuinely convinced herself she was helping me. That made the situation sadder, not better. We talked for another hour. Then they left. I stood at the front window and watched their black BMW X7 disappear down the street. The house became quiet again. A few minutes later, I called Hank. He answered on the second ring. What's wrong? How do you know something's wrong? You only call before dinner when something's wrong. Fair point. I told him everything. The condo, the project, the pressure, the conversation. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he asked one question. Do you trust it? No. Do you trust them? That question took longer. Finally, I answered honestly. I trust that they want something. Hank grunted. That's not the same thing. No, it isn't. After we hung up, I sat alone at Claire's kitchen table. The Bellevue Shores folder sat in front of me. Outside rain tapped softly against the window. Inside, something didn't add up. The numbers, the urgency, the pressure. None of it felt right. And when things don't feel right, I've learned to pay attention. Because people lie. Documents lie. Sales pitches definitely lie. But numbers usually tell the truth. You just have to know where to look. And a week later, I started looking. I've always trusted numbers more than people. That probably sounds cynical. It isn't. People tell you what they hope is true. Numbers tell you what is true. Those aren't always the same thing. The Monday after Madison and Brandon visited, I sat at my kitchen table with the Bellevue Shores folder spread out in front of me. The clock on the microwave read 7:14 a.m. A cup of coffee sat beside my elbow. Outside Milwaukee was wrapped in a gray spring drizzle. Inside I was staring at financial projections that felt strangely optimistic. Not impossible, just optimistic. And optimism in the investment world is often another word for selective storytelling. Now I should explain something. Before retiring, I spent nearly 3 decades working as a military language analyst and interpreter. Most people hear that and imagine I spent my career translating conversations. Sometimes I did. But the real job was identifying inconsistencies, patterns, tiny details that didn't match, a misplaced phrase, an unusual word choice, a contradiction hidden inside a larger story. You learn to notice when pieces don't fit, and Bellevue Shores didn't fit. The projected sales prices looked aggressive. The development timeline looked unrealistic. The financing structure looked fragile. None of those things alone proved anything. Together they bothered me, so I started making phone calls. Not because I wanted to catch my daughter doing something wrong. I need you to understand that. At that point, I was still hoping I'd discover I was simply being overprotective. Maybe Madison had found an incredible opportunity. Maybe I was becoming one of those stubborn old men who mistrust anything newer than a rotary telephone. I've met those men. Some of them are my friends. Unfortunately, the deeper I looked, the worse things became. My first call was to an old acquaintance named Roger Bennett. Roger had spent 30 years in commercial banking before retiring. If money was moving somewhere in Wisconsin, Roger usually knew somebody who knew somebody involved. I bought him lunch at a diner near Wauwatosa. By the time dessert arrived, Roger had already given me enough information to make me uncomfortable. That project's behind schedule. How far behind? Several months. I nodded. Not ideal, but not disastrous. Then Roger continued. Cost overruns too? How bad? He named a number. I nearly dropped my fork. The figure was significantly larger than what Madison had shown me. Significantly. Are you sure? Roger laughed. Tyson, I spent 30 years lending money. Nobody survives that long by being unsure. Fair point. I drove home thinking about that conversation. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. A few days later, I met Hank for breakfast. George Webb, booth number 4, same as always. The waitress knew our orders before we sat down. That's either loyalty or laziness. I'm still not sure which. Hank listened while I explained what Roger had told me. When I finished, he rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Then he said something that stuck with me. People don't pressure family unless they're running out of options. That sentence landed hard, because suddenly everything looked different. The urgency, the repeated conversations, the carefully prepared presentations, the timing, all of it. Maybe Madison wasn't simply excited. Maybe she was desperate. That's a very different thing. And desperate people make dangerous decisions, especially when they're convinced they're right. Over the next 2 weeks, I kept digging. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just research, public records, property filings, corporate registrations, business reports, the boring stuff, the stuff most people never bother reading, the stuff that reveals everything. One afternoon, I found myself staring at a stack of documents at the Milwaukee Public Library. And that's where something finally clicked. Bellevue Shores wasn't simply underfunded. It was heavily underfunded. The projected financing gap was enormous, far larger than Madison had implied. A cold feeling settled into my stomach, because suddenly I understood why my house mattered. My house wasn't the goal. My house was the solution. To them, it represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in available equity, liquidity, capital, funding, whatever business term you wanted to use. To me, it was home. To them, it was leverage. That realization hurt more than I expected. Not because of the money, because of what it suggested. Madison knew exactly what the house meant to me. She knew every memory attached to it, every Christmas, every birthday, every family photograph hanging in the hallway, and yet somehow she'd begun seeing it differently. Not emotionally, financially. I wish I could tell you I got angry. I didn't. Not immediately. Mostly I felt sad. That's the thing people don't tell you about betrayal. The anger usually arrives later. Sadness gets there first. A week later, Madison called. I was changing the oil in my lawn tractor when my phone rang. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetheart. Have you had time to think about Bellevue Shores?" There it was. Again, the pressure. Polite, friendly, persistent. "I've looked into it a little." A brief pause, then another. Too long. Just long enough for me to know she was nervous. "What do you think?" I deliberately kept my voice neutral. "I think it's ambitious." She laughed. "That's one way to describe it." "How's the financing coming?" Silence. Not complete silence. The kind where someone is rapidly deciding how much truth to reveal. "It's coming together." Interesting answer. Not a yes, not a no, just a carefully constructed middle ground. We talked for another few minutes before hanging up. When the call ended, I sat on the back steps and stared across the yard. The maple tree was beginning to bloom. Claire had loved that tree. Every spring she'd stand at the kitchen window and announce its progress like a proud parent. I could almost hear her voice, and for the first time I found myself wondering what she'd say about all this. Probably something wiser than anything I came up with. Claire had always understood people better than I did. I understood language. She understood hearts. That's why she spotted trouble long before anyone else. I missed that. I still do. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle arrived, completely by accident. One of my old professional contacts returned a call. A former colleague from Chicago who now worked in commercial development consulting. When I mentioned Bellevue Shores, he immediately recognized the name. That wasn't unusual. What he said next was, "Interesting project." "Good interesting or bad interesting," he laughed. "Depends which side of the table you're sitting on." Then he explained. Several investors had become nervous. Timelines were slipping. Costs were rising. Internal disagreements were growing. Nothing catastrophic. Yet. But enough to create pressure. Lots of pressure. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. Because now the situation was becoming clear. Madison and Brandon weren't trying to improve my future. They were trying to rescue their own. Maybe they believed success was right around the corner. Maybe they genuinely thought everything would work out. Maybe they planned to pay me back someday. I don't know. What I do know is this. When people become desperate enough, they start convincing themselves that bad decisions are temporary sacrifices. That's how good people end up doing bad things. And Madison wasn't a bad person. Not yet. She was simply standing too close to a cliff she couldn't see. The problem was that she wasn't standing there alone. She was trying to pull me with her. And as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing another stack of documents, I realized something important. I wasn't looking at a misunderstanding anymore. I was looking at a plan. A plan that depended on me staying uninformed. A plan that depended on me trusting without verifying. A plan that depended on me being exactly the kind of old man Madison believed I was. Fortunately for me, and unfortunately for her. She had underestimated the wrong person. Then came the dinner at an Italian restaurant, and that's when I discovered my daughter wasn't the only person in the room with a secret. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Madison called around 3 o'clock. I was in my garage attempting to organize a collection of tools that had somehow spent the previous 20 years reproducing themselves. Seriously, I owned 3 tape measures. At least I thought I owned 3. By the time I finished cleaning, I had discovered 7. Nobody knows how that happens. It just does. My phone rang. Madison. Hi, Dad. Hi, sweetheart. You busy Saturday night? Depends. On what? Whether you're asking me to help move furniture. She laughed. A genuine laugh this time. For a moment she sounded like the little girl who used to sit on my shoulders at Milwaukee County Zoo. That made what happened later hurt even more. No furniture, she said. Good. We're having dinner. Who's we? Me, Brandon, and one of our business partners. That got my attention. A business dinner. Sort of. You'll see. Whenever someone says you'll see, it usually means they don't want to explain something yet. I agreed anyway. Saturday evening arrived cold and windy. Typical Wisconsin spring weather. The restaurant was called Moretti's, a family-owned Italian place just outside downtown Milwaukee. Not flashy, not trendy. The kind of restaurant where the food mattered more than the furniture. I liked it immediately. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. Military service teaches punctuality. Retirement never cured it. Madison and Brandon arrived a few minutes later, both dressed like they were attending a corporate presentation. Not dinner, presentation, another small detail, another small alarm bell. Then the 4th member of our party arrived, Vincent Romano, 50-something, expensive navy suit, silver watch that probably cost more than my Avalon, perfectly trimmed beard, confident handshake. The kind of confidence that comes from spending years in rooms where people usually agree with you. Mr. Cox. Tyson is fine. Vincent. We sat. Menus appeared. Drinks were ordered. Conversation began. At first everything felt normal. Vincent was charming. I'll give him that. He knew how to tell stories, how to make people laugh, how to make every business project sound like the opportunity of a lifetime. By the time appetizers arrived, he'd already described Bellevue Shores as a once-in-a-generation investment. I've lived through enough generations to know those happen surprisingly often. Every few years, somebody discovers another one. I smiled politely. Mostly, I listened. Listening has always been one of my strengths. People reveal remarkable things when they think you're not paying attention. An hour into dinner, I noticed something. Vincent and Madison occasionally exchanged glances. Not unusual. Business partners do that. What caught my attention was what happened next. Vincent asked a question. Not in English. In Italian. Madison answered immediately. Also in Italian. Now stay with me here. This is where the story really begins. Because Madison had absolutely no idea who her father used to be. She knew I worked for the government. She knew I traveled. She knew I spent years overseas. But she never cared much about the details. Most children don't. To her, those years existed somewhere in the vague historical category labeled Dad before I was born. The truth was a little different. For nearly 3 decades, languages had been my life. I didn't just learn them. I analyzed them, lived inside them, worked inside them. I spent years interpreting conversations where understanding a single sentence incorrectly could create serious consequences. Italian wasn't my strongest language, but it was strong enough. More than strong enough. And as Madison casually replied to Vincent, I understood every word. At first, the conversation seemed harmless. Business details, scheduling, timelines. Then things changed. Vincent lowered his voice slightly. Not enough, just slightly, and he asked a question, in Italian. Do you think he'll agree soon? Madison glanced at me, then smiled. The kind of smile children use when discussing adults they believe aren't paying attention. He'll come around. I kept eating, kept nodding, kept pretending I didn't understand. Inside, something cold settled into my chest, because suddenly I wasn't listening to a business discussion. I was listening to a strategy session about me. Vincent asked another question. "What if he refuses?" Madison shrugged, still smiling, still speaking Italian. "He won't." The certainty in her voice bothered me, not because she was confident, because she sounded entitled, like my agreement had already been included in her calculations, like my house already belonged to the future she'd imagined. Brandon remained mostly silent. That interested me too. He understood some Italian. Not much, enough to follow parts of the conversation. Enough to look uncomfortable, not enough to control it. The discussion continued, and then came the sentence I'll never forget. Vincent asked about funding, specifically the remaining funding gap. Madison answered, and for the first time, the mask slipped. Once the house is sold, the rest becomes easy. The house, not Dad's house, not Tyson's home, the house, a line item, an asset, a solution, a funding source, nothing more. I felt something twist inside me. Not anger, not yet. Heartbreak. Because in that moment I realized we weren't having different conversations anymore. We were living in different realities. I saw memories. She saw liquidity. I saw Claire. She saw capital. That's a painful realization, especially when it comes from your own child. The waiter arrived with entrees. Conversation shifted. Everyone returned to English. I smiled, made small talk, asked questions, told a story about getting lost in Chicago 30 years earlier. Nobody suspected anything. Not Vincent, not Brandon, certainly not Madison. And that's when I made a decision. I wouldn't confront them. Not there. Not yet. You know that feeling when somebody accidentally reveals their cards during a poker game? You don't interrupt them. You don't announce it. You let them keep playing. That's exactly what I did. The evening continued. Dessert arrived. Coffee arrived. More discussion followed. And then right near the end of the meal, Madison made another mistake. A much bigger one. Vincent asked whether I knew about the financing issues. Madison laughed softly. Then she answered in Italian. He doesn't even know what questions to ask. I nearly smiled. Because that sentence was so spectacularly wrong, it became funny. Not immediately funny, later funny. The kind of funny you appreciate after the shock wears off. For 30 years, asking the right questions had literally been my job. Yet there sat my daughter confidently assuring a business partner that I didn't know which questions mattered. The irony was beautiful and tragic. Mostly tragic. The check arrived. Vincent paid. Everybody stood. Handshakes, goodbyes, parking lot conversations, normal things. Then I drove home, alone. The streets were quiet. Lake Michigan disappeared into darkness to my left. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, and my mind replayed every Italian sentence I'd heard that evening. Every word, every implication, every assumption. When I reached home, I didn't go inside immediately. Instead, I sat in the driveway. The porch light illuminated the front steps Claire used to decorate every fall. For a long time, I simply looked at the house. The house Madison thought was a solution. The house Vincent thought was funding. The house that contained 34 years of my life. Then I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because suddenly I understood something. Madison thought she was the only person at that table with a secret. She thought she was managing the flow of information. She thought she controlled the conversation. What she didn't know was that I'd heard every word. And from that moment forward, the game changed completely. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't suspicious anymore. Now I knew. And once you know the truth, you can start preparing. That night I opened a new folder on my computer, then another, and another, Because if Madison wanted to build a future using my house, I intended to learn exactly how she planned to do it. The next morning I met Hank at George Webb. Saturday night had left me with a strange combination of emotions, disappointment, sadness, relief, and something else, clarity. For months I'd been wondering whether I was imagining things, whether I was becoming overly suspicious, whether grief and age were making me see problems where none existed. Now I knew better. The conversation at Moretti's had answered that question. Unfortunately, it had raised several new ones. Hank took one look at me as I slid into the booth. "Uh-oh. What? You've got the face." "What face?" "The one you get when you've figured something out." I laughed. "You make me sound dangerous." "You are dangerous." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Hank, I'm 68. "Exactly." He pointed his fork at me. "You know who's dangerous, a 25-year-old with confidence." I raised an eyebrow. "No, a 68-year-old with evidence." That got my attention. "Evidence? You're smiling." "I am not." "You are?" "I don't think I am." "You absolutely are." The waitress arrived with our breakfasts, pancakes for Hank, eggs and toast for me. She set down the plates and shook her head. "You two argue like an old married couple." "That's because Tyson is impossible." "I heard that." "You were supposed to." The waitress laughed and walked away. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Then Hank leaned forward. "What happened?" So I told him. Everything. The dinner, the Italian conversation, the funding problems, the comments about the house, the assumption that I didn't understand. By the time I finished, Hank's pancakes had gone cold, which is how I knew he was paying attention. Hank loved pancakes. Wow. Yeah. That's bad. Yeah. That's really bad. I nodded. For a while he stared out the window. Cars passed on Oklahoma Avenue. Rain threatened again. Wisconsin seemed committed to making spring as depressing as possible. Finally, Hank spoke. "So what are you going to do?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself all night. The truth was simple. I didn't want revenge. Not really. That's important. People hear stories like this and assume the goal becomes punishment. It wasn't. Madison was still my daughter, the little girl who once insisted on sleeping with a stuffed rabbit until she was 12. The teenager who cried when her first car broke down. The young woman who sat beside Claire's hospital bed, holding her hand. Those memories don't disappear just because somebody disappoints you, at least they didn't for me. I want the truth. Hank nodded. That's different. Very. You think she's actually trying to hurt you? That question lingered, because it mattered. A lot. Finally, I answered honestly. No. Then what? I sighed. I think she believes she's solving a problem. Hank considered that, then nodded slowly. That's worse. Why? Because people doing bad things for bad reasons sometimes stop. I looked at him. People doing bad things for good reasons usually don't. That sat between us for a moment. Because he was right. Madison genuinely believed Bellevue Shores would succeed. I was almost certain of that. The problem was that belief doesn't make bad decisions less dangerous. Sometimes it makes them more dangerous. After breakfast, I drove home. The rest of the weekend passed quietly. But Monday morning marked the beginning of something new. Preparation. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, nothing exciting enough for television. Just organization, documentation, patience, the adult version of setting a trap. I bought a new external hard drive, labeled folders, created backups, archived emails, saved text messages, recorded dates, meeting times, conversations, every interaction involving Bellevue Shores, everything. If that sounds excessive, you haven't spent years working around intelligence professionals. Trust me, compared to them, I was being lazy. One afternoon, while organizing files, I stumbled across something unexpected. A series of emails Madison had forwarded months earlier. At the time, I hadn't paid much attention. Now I read them carefully, very carefully. The interesting thing about people who think they're smarter than everyone else is that they eventually stop being careful. They become comfortable. Comfort creates mistakes, and mistakes create evidence. The emails weren't explosive. Not yet. But they established timelines, conversations, relationships, promises, financial expectations, tiny pieces, nothing spectacular individually. Together, different story. As the days passed, I started noticing something else. Madison's behavior was changing. The phone calls became more frequent. The conversations became more urgent. The suggestions became more specific. Almost every discussion somehow returned to the house. Had I considered downsizing? Had I talked to a realtor? Had I thought about retirement communities? Did I realize how much maintenance costs had increased? The pattern became impossible to miss. One Wednesday evening, she called while I was grilling burgers in the backyard. "Dad." "Hi. What are you doing?" "Trying not to burn dinner." She laughed, then immediately shifted topics. The house. Again, always the house. By the end of the call, I found myself staring at the grill long after we'd hung up. Not because I was angry, because I was counting. The call had lasted 14 minutes. She mentioned the house 9 times. 9. You start noticing strange statistics when you're paying attention. The following Friday, Hank stopped by unexpectedly. He carried a cardboard box. "What is that?" He placed it on my kitchen table. "A gift." I opened it. Inside were folders, dozens of folders, color-coded, labeled, perfectly organized. I stared at him. "Hank." "What?" "You bought office supplies." "Yes." "For me?" "Yes. That's the most retired police officer thing I've ever seen." He looked offended. "I'll have you know these are premium folders." I laughed harder than I had in weeks. Sometimes healing arrives disguised as stupidity. That's friendship. We spent the next 2 hours organizing documents. At one point, Hank held up a yellow folder. "What goes in this one?" "Financial projections." "What about the blue one?" "Emails." "The green one?" "Potential bad decisions." He paused. "We're gonna need a bigger green folder." I nearly spilled my coffee. That moment mattered more than either of us realized, because amid all the tension and disappointment, it reminded me of something important. Life wasn't only betrayal. It wasn't only conflict. There were still good people, still laughter, still friendship, still reasons to smile. By the end of the evening, my evidence files looked impressive. Not complete, but growing. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together, and the clearer the picture became, the more concerned I grew. Because Bellevue Shores wasn't stabilizing. If anything, the pressure seemed to be increasing. Investors were nervous, deadlines were approaching, money was tightening, and desperate people rarely become less desperate over time. Then about 10 days later, Madison made the first truly serious mistake. Not a suspicious comment, not an awkward conversation, not an assumption. A mistake. The kind of mistake that changes everything. The kind of mistake you can never take back. It arrived in my inbox at 8:17 on a Tuesday morning. And when I opened the attachment, I realized my daughter had accidentally handed me exactly what I needed. The email arrived at exactly 8:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the time because I was sitting at my kitchen table eating toast that was slightly more burned than intended. Age teaches you something interesting. At a certain point, you stop pretending you'll become good at things you've always been bad at. I'd been making toast for over 60 years. I was still terrible at it. My laptop sat open beside me. The morning sunlight was coming through the kitchen window. The maple tree outside had finally started turning green. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Then my inbox refreshed. A new message appeared. From Madison. The subject line read, "Draft Review, Internal Only." That was unusual. Madison rarely sent me business documents. When she did, it was usually intentional. This clearly wasn't. At first, I assumed she'd forwarded something accidentally. It happens. We've all done it. I clicked. The email itself was short, very short, just one sentence. Please review the updated strategy document before Thursday's investor meeting. Below that sat an attachment, an Excel spreadsheet. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looked particularly important, at least not initially. Then I opened it, and everything changed. The file was titled asset_conversion_strategy_v4.xlsx. Even the name bothered me. Asset conversion. Not retirement planning, not family estate planning, not future housing considerations. Asset conversion. Corporate language. Cold language. Language that removes people from the equation. I opened the spreadsheet. Several tabs appeared across the bottom. Funding schedule, investor allocation, property sources, bridge capital, projected equity events. I clicked through them one by one. The first few pages were complicated but ordinary. Development budgets, construction estimates, financing projections. Nothing surprising. Then I opened a tab labeled Property Sources, and there it was, line number 7, highlighted in yellow. South Logan Avenue residence, my house, estimated liquidation value $612,000. Expected available equity $487,000. Target conversion date Q3. For several seconds I simply stared, not because I didn't understand, because I understood perfectly. My house wasn't listed as a possibility. It wasn't listed as an option. It wasn't listed as a discussion point. It was listed as part of the plan, a completed assumption, a future certainty. I leaned back slowly. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the street. Inside, I continued reading. The deeper I went, the worse it became. The spreadsheet wasn't merely tracking investments. It was tracking anticipated funding sources, and several calculations clearly depended on receiving proceeds from the sale of my home. Without those proceeds, the projections became much less attractive. Several financing gaps appeared immediately. The project didn't completely collapse, but it became significantly more vulnerable. Interesting. Very interesting. Then I found something even more troubling. A notes section. Short comments attached to several entries. Most were ordinary, routine business observations. Then I reached mine. The note beside my property read, "Family asset. High probability of cooperation after downsizing discussion." I read it twice, then 3 times. Family asset. Not father, not Tyson. Family asset. You know that feeling when somebody accidentally reveals how they truly think? It's never pleasant. That note revealed more than Madison probably realized, because it showed exactly how she had begun viewing the situation. Not emotionally, strategically. I continued scrolling. Then I discovered the tab that truly frightened me. Projected equity events. The title sounded harmless. It wasn't. Buried inside was a timeline, a detailed timeline, dates, conversations, expected milestones, future actions. And sitting right in the middle was a line that made my stomach drop. Appraisal adjustment discussion? That phrase immediately caught my attention. Why? Because I knew the current market value of my house. I'd already researched it extensively. The number listed in the spreadsheet was significantly lower. Not a little lower, significantly lower. Enough to matter, enough to raise serious questions, enough to suggest somebody wanted a discounted valuation. I stared at the screen, then printed everything. Every tab, every page, every note. By the time the printer finished, the stack measured nearly half an inch thick. I placed the documents inside one of Hank's color-coded folders. Green. Appropriately enough, the potential bad decisions folder. Then I waited, because I knew what was coming next. At 8:46 a.m. my phone rang. Madison. That timing told me everything. She'd realized her mistake. "Hi, sweetheart." Silence. Then, "Did you get an email from me?" Interesting. No greeting, no small talk. Straight to the issue. "Maybe?" Another pause. "What do you mean, maybe? I get lots of emails." "You know which one I mean." I almost smiled. Panic has a sound. This was it. "Oh, that one. Can you delete it? Immediately?" Not eventually. Not please review it. Delete it immediately. That word mattered. Why? It's an internal document. I noticed. Another pause. Longer this time. Then she laughed. A forced laugh. The kind people use when they realize things are slipping. "It's just a draft. Seems detailed for a draft. Those numbers aren't finalized." "Which numbers?" Silence again. Now she was choosing carefully. Very carefully. "The whole thing." Interesting answer. Too broad. Too vague. Too rehearsed. We talked for several more minutes. Or rather, Madison attempted to guide the conversation while I asked innocent questions. Questions she clearly didn't enjoy. Eventually, she ended the call. The moment she hung up, I wrote down everything I remembered. Every statement, every hesitation, every contradiction, old habit, good habits. The next few days became revealing. Madison called twice more. Brandon called once. Neither mentioned the spreadsheet directly, but both suddenly became very interested in my plans. Had I thought more about selling? Had I considered an appraisal? Would I be willing to meet with a real estate consultant? The pressure was increasing, and that told me something important. They needed movement, soon. Meanwhile, I continued studying the documents. The more I reviewed them, the more concerned I became. Not because of the project itself, because of the assumptions. Everything depended on optimistic outcomes, perfect timing, perfect financing, perfect sales, perfect cooperation, including mine. That's a dangerous way to build anything. Businesses, relationships, families, all of them eventually collapse when they're built on assumptions. 3 evenings later, Hank came over. I handed him the folder. 20 minutes later, he looked up. His expression wasn't encouraging. "Wow. Yeah. That's bad. Yeah." He flipped through several more pages, then stopped. "Tyson." "What? You see this?" He pointed at a highlighted section. I leaned closer. Then my stomach tightened. Because I hadn't noticed it before. A reference number. A document number. Attached to an appraisal discussion. The problem, the document date, didn't make sense. Not at all. The timeline appeared wrong. Suspiciously wrong. Potentially very wrong. And for the first time, a possibility entered my mind. A possibility I didn't want to believe. Not because it was impossible. Because it involved my daughter. I sat back, slowly. Hank watched me. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he said the one thing I was already thinking. "Tyson." "Yeah. I think it's time you talk to a lawyer." I looked down at the spreadsheet, then at the stack of printed pages, then toward the family photographs hanging in my hallway. One picture showed Madison at 12 years old, missing front tooth, holding a softball trophy, smiling, back when life was simpler, back before investment projects and financing gaps and strategy documents, back before family became a funding source. I stared at that picture for a long moment. Then I nodded, because deep down I knew Hank was right. And a week later I found myself sitting across from one of the sharpest real estate attorneys in Milwaukee. The law office sat on East Wisconsin Avenue, 12 floors above downtown Milwaukee. The building itself wasn't impressive. No marble columns, no giant gold lettering, no dramatic movie lawyer atmosphere. Just clean glass doors, quiet elevators, and the kind of waiting room that smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Honestly, that made me trust it more. People who are good at their jobs rarely need chandeliers to prove it. Hank came with me, not because I needed legal advice, because every man should have one friend who shows up when things get complicated. Preferably a friend who carries emergency snacks and insults in equal quantities. Hank excelled at both. As we sat waiting, he handed me a package of peanut butter crackers. "You nervous?" "No, you're lying. I'm 68. I don't have enough energy left to lie." He nodded. "Fair." A moment later, a woman stepped into the reception area. "Mr. Cox." That was Dana Whitaker, 57 years old, sharp eyes, short gray blonde hair, dark blue blazer, the kind of person who looked like she noticed everything. Within 10 seconds, I suspected she probably did. We followed her into her office. The room overlooked Lake Michigan. Not a spectacular view, but a good one. The sort of view earned through competence rather than luck. Dana sat behind her desk. I handed her the green folder. Hank's famous green folder. Potential bad decisions. Dana opened it. Then she started reading. For the first 5 minutes, nobody spoke. Pages turned, notes were reviewed, emails were examined, spreadsheets were studied. The room remained completely silent. That silence told me something. Experienced professionals become quiet when they're thinking. Inexperienced professionals become loud. Finally, Dana looked up. "How much of this has your daughter seen you review?" "None." "Good." That answer surprised me. "Good. Very." She returned to the documents. Several more minutes passed. Then she leaned back. The expression on her face had changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough for me to know she had found something. "Mr. Cox?" "Please call me Tyson." "Tyson." She tapped one of the printed pages. "This spreadsheet concerns me." "Which part?" "Several parts." Not encouraging. Dana flipped through the folder. Eventually, she stopped on a document I recognized immediately. The timeline section Hank had flagged. The document reference number. The date, inconsistency. Dana pointed to it. "Did you notice this?" "We noticed it." Hank and I." She smiled slightly. "I already like Hank." "Most people do. Smart people usually do." Hank looked very pleased with himself. Which was unfortunate, because encouragement only made him worse. Dana continued reviewing. Then she asked a question that changed the entire conversation. "Has anyone asked you to sign anything?" I hesitated, then nodded. "A few preliminary documents." "Did you?" "No." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good." Again with the good. I was beginning to appreciate that word. Then Dana explained what she was seeing. Not proof of fraud, not yet, but warning signs. Serious warning signs. The projected valuation assumptions, the timeline discrepancies, the pressure surrounding asset conversion, the references to appraisal discussions, individually concerning, together, potentially much more significant. I listened carefully. So did Hank. At one point, Dana paused and studied me. Why are you here? The question caught me off guard. Because my daughter is trying to pressure me into selling my house. Dana shook her head. No. I frowned. No. That's not why you're here. The room became quiet. Then she continued. You're here because you think your daughter is becoming someone you don't recognize. That one hit. Hard. Because it was true. Far more true than my answer. For a moment I couldn't speak. Neither could Hank. Dana wasn't finished. And you're hoping I'm going to tell you this is all a misunderstanding. I looked out the window. Lake Michigan shimmered in the distance. Finally I answered. Yes. Dana nodded slowly. I understand. Then she gave me the answer I was afraid to hear. I can't tell you that. The room fell silent again. Not dramatic silence. Heavy silence. The kind that settles into your chest. Because deep down, I'd still been hoping. Hoping there was another explanation. Hoping I was wrong. Hoping this would all somehow make sense. Instead, Dana spent the next hour explaining exactly why my concerns were reasonable. The more she talked, the clearer the situation became. Bellevue Shores wasn't necessarily a scam. That distinction mattered. Projects fail all the time without being scams. The problem was different. The project appeared increasingly dependent on assumptions that might not materialize. And several people seemed determined to solve those problems using my equity. My house, my future, my risk, without fully informing me. That wasn't illegal by itself, but it was dangerous, very dangerous. Then Dana found something else, a detail hidden inside one of the supporting documents, a signature line, an internal authorization section. Nothing spectacular at first glance. Then she looked closer, very closely. And suddenly her expression changed. I noticed immediately. People who analyze language for a living become sensitive to facial expressions. Tiny ones, the ones most people miss. Dana stared at the page, then at another page, then back again. What? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid two documents side by side. One was genuine. The other appeared to be a copied authorization draft. My stomach tightened, because even from across the desk, I could see the problem. The signatures didn't match. Not perfectly, not naturally, close enough to pass casual inspection, not close enough to survive professional scrutiny. Dana leaned back. Interesting. That's lawyer language. Interesting never means interesting. It usually means trouble. What is it? She folded her hands. I'm not making accusations. Fair. But if these documents are connected the way I think they are, somebody may have been practicing your signature. The room went completely still. I wish I could describe a dramatic reaction. There wasn't one. No shouting, no table pounding, no movie scene, just silence. Because some statements are too serious for immediate emotion. They require processing. I stared at the papers, then at Dana, then at Hank. Finally I spoke. Are you saying Madison forged something? No. Then what are you saying? I'm saying I would like to see additional documents before reaching any conclusions. Careful, measured, professional, exactly what a good attorney should say. But the possibility now existed. And once a possibility exists, you can't unsee it. The meeting lasted another hour. By the end, Dana had given me clear instructions. Save everything, archive everything, respond normally. Do not reveal what I knew. Most importantly, do not confront Madison. Not yet. That last instruction surprised me. You don't want me to talk to her? Dana shook her head. No. Why? Because people tell the truth when they think they're safe. I sat quietly, thinking about that. Then she added something else, something that would prove incredibly important later. If your daughter believes you don't know what's happening, She'll eventually show you exactly what's happening. That sentence stayed with me. The entire drive home, the entire week afterward. Every conversation, every email, every phone call. Because Dana was right. Madison still believed she controlled the situation. She still believed I was reacting, following, responding. She had no idea I was preparing, no idea Donna existed, no idea the evidence file was growing, no idea the trap she was building for me was slowly becoming a trap for herself. And perhaps most importantly, she still had absolutely no idea that I understood every word of Italian she'd spoken at Moretti's. As Hank and I left the law office, Donna asked one final question. A simple question. One I never forgot. When the moment comes, Tyson, can you stay calm? I smiled, for the first time in weeks. Then I gave her the most honest answer I could. Ma'am, I spent years translating conversations between people who wanted to kill each other. Dana laughed. So that's a yes, I nodded. I can handle my daughter in high heels. 3 weeks later, Madison scheduled a family meeting she believed she completely controlled. And that's when everything began moving toward the moment she'd never see coming. 3 weeks later, Madison called and told me we needed to have a family meeting. The phrase itself wasn't unusual. Families have meetings about holidays, medical decisions, retirement plans, who forgot Grandma's birthday, normal things. This wasn't one of those meetings. I knew it before she finished the sentence. Dad, I think it's time we all sat down together. There was a certain energy in her voice, confidence, relief, anticipation, the sound of somebody who believed the finish line was finally in sight. Sure. You can come Friday. What time? 3 o'clock. Where? Our office. That made me smile. Not externally, internally. Because family meetings usually happen around kitchen tables, not conference tables. This wasn't a family meeting. This was a presentation, a closing argument, a carefully planned event. And Madison expected only one outcome. My agreement. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at the Bellevue Shores regional office in downtown Milwaukee. The building occupied part of a renovated commercial property near the historic Third Ward. Glass walls, modern furniture, expensive artwork. The kind of place designed to convince investors they were already successful. I arrived 15 minutes early. Old habits. Still, my silver Avalon looked almost comical sitting between luxury SUVs and imported sedans. I parked anyway. One advantage of reaching 68 is that embarrassment loses much of its power. Inside, a young receptionist greeted me. She couldn't have been older than 23. Perfect smile, perfect posture, perfect corporate training. She escorted me toward the conference room. As we walked, I noticed Bellevue Shores renderings hanging throughout the hallway. Luxury docks, luxury homes, luxury lifestyles, luxury promises, always luxury promises. The conference room itself was impressive. Large glass walls overlooked downtown Milwaukee. A polished walnut table stretched through the center. Multiple screens displayed project renderings. Bottled water sat neatly arranged at every seat. Everything had been prepared carefully, very carefully. I wasn't the first person there. Vincent Romano stood near one of the windows speaking into his phone. He wore another expensive suit, dark charcoal this time. He spotted me immediately. Tyson? Vincent. Firm handshake, professional smile, confident eyes. He looked relaxed. That interested me. People only look that relaxed when they think they're winning. A few minutes later, Brandon entered. Unlike Vincent, Brandon looked exhausted. The circles under his eyes were impossible to miss. The man hadn't been sleeping. That told me something, too. Pressure leaves fingerprints. Not always physical ones, but signs appear eventually. Brandon shook my hand. His smile looked forced. His eyes drifted toward the conference table, then toward the door, then back again. Nervous, very nervous. Interesting. Then Madison arrived, and suddenly I understood exactly how she viewed this meeting. She was dressed for victory. Navy business suit, perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect confidence. Everything about her communicated certainty, not hope, certainty. That hurt more than I expected, because I realized she genuinely believed she had already solved the problem. And in her mind, I was the final signature. Nothing more, nothing less. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetheart." She kissed my cheek, smiled warmly, then immediately began discussing paperwork. That transition felt oddly symbolic. The room gradually filled. 2 additional investors arrived. A project consultant, a financial analyst, several people I'd never met, and every single one of them seemed to share the same assumption. Tyson Cox was here to cooperate. I sat quietly, observed, listened, the way I always had. At 3:07 p.m., Madison officially started the meeting. A presentation appeared on the large screen. Bellevue Shores, Future Growth Strategy. The title alone nearly made me laugh. Future Growth Strategy. That's corporate language for please ignore our current problems. For the next 40 minutes, Madison walked everyone through projections, revenue forecasts, development phases, financing opportunities, market demand, return expectations. She was good, very good, confident, articulate, prepared. Watching her speak reminded me why she'd become successful in real estate. She knew how to sell belief. The problem was that belief and reality were increasingly living in separate neighborhoods. As the presentation continued, I noticed something else. Nobody mentioned risk. Not really. They acknowledged challenges, they discussed variables, they talked about contingencies. But actual risk, almost never. That's another warning sign. Whenever a room becomes too optimistic, somebody is usually hiding something. Eventually, Madison arrived at the section I knew was coming. Asset alignment, different wording, same objective. My house. She discussed property resources, future liquidity events, potential restructuring opportunities, all very professional, all very sanitized, all carefully designed to avoid saying what was actually happening. Then she looked directly at me. "Tyson has been reviewing several options." "Interesting." Tyson, not Dad. Tyson. We had become business terminology. I almost admired the efficiency. Almost. "He understands the opportunities available." Several heads nodded around the table. I remained silent. "He also understands the long-term advantages of transitioning into a more manageable living arrangement." More nodding. Still silent. Madison smiled. The confident smile returned, the one she'd perfected over years of closing deals. Then she placed a folder in front of me. "Take a look." I opened it. Inside sat several documents. Property valuation estimates, transition plans, housing alternatives, and one proposed authorization form. Interesting, very interesting. I flipped through slowly, carefully. The room watched, waiting. The atmosphere felt almost theatrical. Everyone expected the next act, the signature, the agreement, the conclusion. Instead, I simply closed the folder. "Thank you." Confusion flickered briefly across Madison's face. Only briefly. Then she recovered. Professionals do that. They adapt quickly. Unfortunately for her, I'd spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. What Madison didn't know was that Dana Whitaker was already downstairs in the building. What Madison didn't know was that Hank Dawson was sitting in the lobby drinking coffee and pretending to read a newspaper. What Madison didn't know was that every relevant email spreadsheet and document had been reviewed, organized and preserved. Most importantly, what Madison didn't know was that I was waiting, patiently, because Dana's prediction had proven correct. People reveal themselves when they feel safe, and Madison felt extremely safe. The meeting continued. Questions were asked, financial projections discussed, investors reassured, timelines reviewed. Everything moved exactly where Madison wanted it to move, closer and closer toward commitment, closer and closer toward signatures, closer and closer toward the trap. Then something happened, small, almost insignificant. Vincent leaned toward Madison. They exchanged a glance, a familiar glance, the same type I'd seen weeks earlier at Moretti's, the kind that says a private conversation is about to begin. My pulse slowed. Not increased, slowed. Years of interpreting high-pressure conversations had taught me something useful. When the important moment arrives, calm becomes an advantage. Excitement creates mistakes. Calm creates opportunities. I sat quietly, hands folded, expression neutral. Just an elderly widower listening to a business discussion, exactly what everyone believed. Vincent smiled. Madison smiled back. Then she turned slightly toward him, and halfway through her sentence, she switched languages. Italian. The same language she believed her father didn't understand. The same language she'd hidden behind for months. The same language that had quietly become the most expensive mistake of her life. And as the first words left her mouth, I realized the moment Donna had warned me about had finally arrived. Madison smiled. Vincent smiled back. Then she switched to Italian, so casually that nobody else in the room seemed to notice. Not the investors, not the consultant, not the financial analyst. To them it was simply two business partners exchanging a quick, private comment. To me it was the sound of a trap finally closing. Unfortunately for Madison, she was standing in the wrong trap. She turned slightly toward Vincent and said, "Once he signs, the remaining funding issue disappears." Vincent nodded. Then he answered in Italian. "And if he hesitates?" Madison gave a small laugh, the kind people use when discussing a problem they've already solved. "He won't. He still thinks we're discussing options." For a moment, nobody else noticed anything unusual. The conversation continued around us. Papers shifted, water bottles moved. A projector hummed softly, and my daughter sat 3 feet away speaking about me as though I wasn't part of the room, as though I couldn't understand, as though I were already a completed transaction. Then came the sentence, the one from the opening of this story, the sentence that changed everything. Vincent glanced toward me, then back at Madison. In Italian, he said, "He doesn't understand a word we're saying." Madison smiled, confident, relaxed, certain, and replied, "Exactly. That's why." I pulled out my chair, sat down, looked directly at both of them, and finished her sentence, in flawless Italian. "That's why you think it's safe to discuss the funding gap in front of me." Silence. Absolute silence. The room froze. Every sound disappeared. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop. Vincent's face lost all color. Madison blinked once, then twice, then simply stared. The expression on her face wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was confusion. Pure confusion. Because her brain was trying to process something it believed was impossible. You know that look. Everybody has seen it at least once. The look someone gets when reality suddenly refuses to follow the script. I folded my hands, then continued speaking in Italian, calmly, clearly, precisely, the same way I'd translated thousands of conversations throughout my career. "Would either of you like me to repeat the discussion from Moretti's restaurant?" Vincent's jaw tightened. Madison didn't move. I continued. "Perhaps the part about the house being the solution." Nobody spoke. or the part where I supposedly didn't know which questions to ask. The consultant looked confused. The investors looked confused. Brandon looked like a man watching a bridge collapse while standing on it. And suddenly, the room belonged to me. Not because I was louder, because I had the truth. That's an important distinction. The truth doesn't need volume. It only needs timing. Madison finally found her voice. "Dad?" "No." The single word stopped her. Not because I shouted. I didn't. I simply said it with certainty. Years of professional interpreting had taught me something useful. Authority isn't created by raising your voice. Authority is created by removing doubt. And in that moment, I had none. I reached into my briefcase, then placed a thick folder on the conference table. Green. Of course it was green. Hank would have been disappointed otherwise. The folder landed with a solid thump. The sound echoed through the room. Then I slid it toward the center. Emails. Nobody moved. Financial projections. Still nothing. Funding schedules. Silence. Internal strategy documents. Now people were staring, especially Vincent, because Vincent had started recognizing some file names, and that terrified him. I opened the folder, removed several documents, then arranged them neatly on the table, one by one, slowly, deliberately. No rushing, no drama, just evidence. The most dangerous thing in the world is often a piece of paper nobody expected you to have. I pointed to the spreadsheet. Asset conversion strategy. The room became even quieter. Then I pointed to the notes section. The one describing my home, the one describing me. Family asset. High probability of cooperation. I let everyone read it. Nobody interrupted. Because there was nothing to interrupt. The words were sitting right there. Printed, highlighted, documented, real. One investor finally spoke. "What exactly is this?" Excellent question. I looked toward Madison, then toward Vincent, then answered. "This is the document where my home stopped being my home and became a financing tool." Nobody liked that answer, especially Madison, because it was true, and truth has a nasty habit of sounding harsher than lies. Madison leaned forward. "Dad, you're taking this out of context." I nodded. "Then explain the context." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. That happens sometimes, especially when reality arrives with paperwork. Then Vincent tried. A mistake. A very expensive mistake. "Mr. Cox, perhaps there has been a misunderstanding." I smiled. For the first time all afternoon. A small smile. The kind that worries people. "Vincent." "Yes. You should never use the word misunderstanding when speaking to someone who spent 30 years professionally analyzing misunderstandings." That landed exactly where I intended. The room remained silent. Then the conference room door opened. Dana Whitaker walked inside, right on schedule. Madison's eyes widened. She recognized her immediately. And that was when fear finally appeared. Not panic, fear. Because for the first time she realized this wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't emotional. This wasn't an angry father reacting. This was preparation. Weeks of preparation. Dana placed her briefcase on the table, then calmly introduced herself. The investors immediately began paying attention. Lawyers tend to have that effect, especially unexpected lawyers. Dana reviewed several documents. Then she discussed the timeline discrepancies, the appraisal concerns, the authorization references, the questionable signature similarities, carefully, professionally, without making accusations, which somehow made it more devastating, because accusations can be argued. Evidence simply sits there. Meanwhile, Brandon looked increasingly miserable. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The man wasn't evil. Weak, maybe. Ambitious, certainly. but not evil. Unfortunately, weakness becomes expensive when paired with bad decisions. One of the investors finally turned toward Vincent. Why wasn't any of this disclosed? No answer. Another investor spoke. Is the funding shortfall larger than we were told? Again, no answer. The room had shifted completely now. Nobody was looking at me anymore. They were looking at Madison and Vincent. The spotlight had moved, and once it moved, it never came back. Within 20 minutes, the meeting effectively collapsed. Questions multiplied. Explanations failed. Confidence evaporated. Vincent stopped speaking almost entirely. Several investors began gathering documents. One quietly left the room to make a phone call. Another requested copies of financial records. The project wasn't dead yet, but it was bleeding badly. Then Madison looked at me. Really looked at me. For the first time in months. Not as an obstacle, not as a funding source, not as a signature, as her father. And what she saw broke my heart, because she finally understood. Not that she had lost. That part didn't matter. She understood that I had known, for weeks, maybe months, and that realization hurt her far more than any legal discussion. Dad? Her voice cracked slightly. Just once. I heard it. So did she. The room continued moving around us. Investors talking, papers shuffling, phones ringing. But for a brief moment, none of that mattered, because the real loss wasn't the project. It wasn't the money. It wasn't Bellevue Shores. It was trust. And trust is much harder to rebuild than a failed development. I stood, closed the green folder, looked at Madison, then quietly said the only thing I wanted her to hear. You never needed to speak another language to hide things from me. She lowered her eyes. I continued. You only needed to stop telling the truth. Then I picked up my briefcase and walked toward the door. Behind me, the meeting continued falling apart. But I wasn't interested in watching, because I had won the room. The problem was that winning the room wasn't the same thing as getting my daughter back. And that reality followed me all the way home. The strange thing about victory is that it rarely feels the way you imagine. Movies teach us that winning comes with music, applause, satisfaction, a perfect ending. Real life usually gives you paperwork and silence. A lot of silence. The Monday after the Bellevue Shores meeting, I sat alone at my kitchen table drinking coffee and staring out at the backyard. The same backyard where Madison had once built snow forts. The same backyard where Claire used to plant tomatoes every spring. The same backyard that had somehow survived 34 Wisconsin winters. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The project began unraveling almost immediately, not because of anything I did afterward. The damage had already been done. The moment investors realized information had been withheld, confidence disappeared. And confidence is the oxygen of large developments. Without it, projects suffocate quickly. Within 2 weeks, one major investor withdrew, then another, then a third. Financing became unstable. Construction timelines slipped again. Additional reviews were requested. Legal departments became involved. Auditors started asking uncomfortable questions. The kind of questions nobody wants asked, especially when millions of dollars are involved. Vincent Romano vanished almost overnight, not literally, but professionally. The confident man who had once dominated every room suddenly became difficult to reach. Meetings were canceled, calls went unanswered, statements became carefully written emails prepared by attorneys. I've seen that transformation before. People are remarkably confident right up until accountability arrives. Then they become very interested in privacy. Brandon called me about 3 weeks after the meeting. The call came at 8:12 p.m. I remember because I nearly didn't answer. His voice sounded exhausted, more exhausted than before. Tyson? Hi, Brandon. A long pause followed. Then he sighed. "I owe you an apology." That surprised me. Not because he was apologizing, because he was doing it voluntarily. There's a difference. Most people apologize when they're cornered. Brandon sounded like a man who had finally gotten tired of carrying something heavy. I should have stopped it. I didn't answer immediately, because I knew exactly what he meant, and because I suspected he'd been carrying that guilt for a while. I knew things were getting out of control. Another pause. I kept telling myself everything would work out. There it was, the most expensive sentence in America. Everything will work out. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people destroy perfectly good relationships while waiting to find out. We talked for nearly 40 minutes. When the call ended, I felt oddly sad. Not angry. Sad. Because Brandon wasn't calling as an investor, or a businessman, or even a son-in-law. He was calling as a man who had watched his life drift somewhere he never intended it to go. I understood that. Probably more than he realized. Madison didn't call. Not that month. Not the next month either. And honestly, I didn't expect her to. Humiliation has a way of making people disappear. Particularly proud people. Especially proud people. Life settled into a quieter rhythm. Summer arrived. The maple tree in the front yard became full and green. George Webb remained terrible and wonderful at the same time. Hank remained Hank. One Tuesday morning, he sat across from me eating pancakes. Again. I honestly believe the man consumed enough pancakes to influence agricultural policy. He pointed his fork at me. "You're thinking. Everybody thinks. Not like that." I laughed. "What does that even mean?" "It means you've got your Claire face." That stopped me, because I knew exactly what he meant. Claire used to sit quietly whenever something important weighed on her mind. Not upset, not angry, just thoughtful. Apparently I'd inherited the expression, or maybe I'd always had it. Either way, Hank noticed. "You miss her?" "Every day." He nodded. No jokes this time, no sarcasm, just understanding. The older you get, the less explanation friendship requires. A few months later, something arrived in my mailbox. A handwritten envelope, no return address. But I recognized the handwriting immediately. Madison. My heart started beating faster. Funny how children can still do that to their parents no matter how old everyone becomes. I carried the envelope into the kitchen, sat down, opened it carefully. The letter wasn't long. 3 pages, yellow legal paper, handwritten. No corporate language, no presentations, no financial projections. Just Madison, for the first time in a very long time. She apologized. Not perfectly, not dramatically, not in a way that erased anything, but honestly. She admitted she'd convinced herself she was helping, admitted she'd become obsessed with saving the project, admitted she'd stopped seeing the difference between opportunity and entitlement. One sentence hit particularly hard. "I stopped seeing the house as your home because I was too busy seeing it as my solution." I read that sentence 4 times, because it was true, painfully true, and because truth is usually the first step toward healing. Not the last step, just the first. The letter ended with a question, not a request, not a demand, a question. "Would you be willing to have lunch?" That was all. No pressure, no expectations, just lunch. I stared at the letter for a long time. Then I called Hank, naturally. "Well, what do you think?" "I think if you ask me one more question, you already know the answer to, I'm hanging up." I laughed. "You think I should go?" "I think Claire would." That settled it. 2 weeks later, I met Madison at a small cafe near Lake Michigan. The meeting felt awkward. Of course it did. Life isn't television. People don't deliver perfect speeches and immediately repair years of damage. Healing is slower, messier, more uncomfortable. Madison looked older somehow. Not physically, emotionally. Like the previous year had finally caught up with her. We talked, carefully at first, then more honestly. There were tears, mostly hers, a few moments of silence, several difficult truths, no miracles, no dramatic reconciliation, just two people trying to find a path back toward each other. That's all. And honestly, that was enough. Today, as I tell you this story, the house is still here. I'm sitting in the same kitchen, at the same table, looking out the same window. The maple tree still stands. The floor still creaks near the hallway. The garage still contains 7 tape measures. Possibly 8 by now. Nobody really knows. Madison visits sometimes. Not as often as I'd like. More often than she used to. We're still rebuilding, still learning, still healing. Some things take time. Maybe they always will. And that's okay, because not every story ends with complete restoration. Sometimes the best ending is simply leaving the door open. And that's what I've done. The door is open. The trust isn't fully rebuilt. The hurt hasn't completely disappeared. But the door is open. For now, that's enough. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this story, it's this. The people who love us can still disappoint us. Sometimes badly. Sometimes in ways we never imagined possible. But disappointment and evil are not the same thing. Many people don't betray others because they hate them. They betray them because they've convinced themselves that a bad decision is actually a necessary one. That's why honesty matters so much. Because once we start turning people into assets, opportunities, solutions, or obstacles, we stop seeing them as people. And that's where real damage begins. Also, never underestimate the quiet person in the room. The one listening. The one observing. The one who doesn't feel the need to announce what they know. Wisdom is often much quieter than arrogance, and patience is far more powerful than pride. If this story meant something to you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been in a situation like this? We read every single one. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.